Welcome to Wider View, the program that provides perspectives on the news outside the narrow confines of the mainstream media. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. My guest today is David Rovics. David is a songwriter, podcaster, and part of the Portland Emergency Eviction Response. He also hosts two podcasts, This Week with David Rovics and Song for Today, which are broadcast on a number of different platforms. And you can find his essays on sites like Counterpunch and Dissident Voice. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Charles. Great to be with you.
Well, I ask you here because we're in a crisis at this point, a pandemic. It doesn't show a lot of signs of dissipating. Unemployment is high. Millions of people around the country are facing eviction. And as you wrote recently, the people in power are well aware of this, but seem to be doing nothing about it. Can you give me kind of your view on the crisis and the response to the people in power?
It's a very interesting situation, because I think there are the people in power in terms of at least the politicians. I think much of the Congress, many other people, state, federal, county level. I mean, pretty much anybody who does not have their heads in the sand is aware that there's a crisis happening and that there's millions of people facing eviction, and they know they can't let that happen. They know that they can't maintain domestic tranquility or deal with the virus if they have millions of people being evicted at the same time. And I mean, they're normally willing to reign over a society where there are millions of evictions every year, but it's a matter of degree. And they seem to think that it's okay to have 1 in 10 renters evicted every year or something. I mean, I can't remember exactly what the statistic is, but it's something astounding like that. There's so many people who are so housing insecure normally, but they know that you can't have, 17 million households or 40 million people or whatever the number is that they think might be facing eviction if they actually let all the protections go and stop with the aid. And so I think they're kicking the can down the road in Oregon and in many other states. It depends, depending on the state, county. It's a lot of different laws going on, but they're extending these eviction bans without actually coming up with a solution that's going to result in not having a tsunami of evictions eventually, And I think the thing is that kicking the can down the road is a lot easier than coming up with a real solution, because the real solution probably will end up hurting the profits of the capitalists to some extent. You could take taxpayer money and pay everybody's 100% of everybody's rent and, turn that into more national debt and whatever. I mean, that's one option, but I think, it's not a very tenable option. And the landlords, I mean, any of the solutions that anybody seems to be talking about involves some kind of compromise on the part of the landlords. Right. And they don't like that, So now they're suing the state of Oregon as of 10 days ago.
Yeah, let's get into that. The ban on evictions in Oregon is extended until July, as I understand it. Without the ban, we've got 25,000 to 57,000 households. Now, we're not talking people, we're talking households. That could be, people with 3 kids, 4 kids, whatever it is. They may be at risk of eviction. And we already have 16,000 people unhoused in Oregon, approximately. Tell us a little bit about what the state was trying to do to address this and why the landlords won't go for it.
I mean, they may have to go for it. We'll see what happens with their lawsuit. I don't know. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know how much legal ground they have to stand on. But certainly, there's a lot of precedent in this country and loads of other countries of government regulating the cost of housing, the cost of the price of land, the price that landlords are allowed to charge for rent. There's lots of precedent for this. We can do that. That we can But rent control, starting with campaigns of the landlord lobby back in the 80s in all 50 states, they ultimately got rid of rent control laws in 48 out of 50 states. So basically, California and New York are the only states left that have actual rent control laws, and they've been so terribly eviscerated, that they are basically not. I mean, they're not worthless, but they're nothing like what they used to be. I do know people in Brooklyn who live in nice 2-bedroom apartments and pay $300 a month for them. But if you don't live in a building that was built before 1947, then you don't qualify for this for New York's version of rent control. So it's a deeply flawed version of rent control. So it's very common that people say rent control doesn't work because they look at California and New York and they say, oh, everything's very expensive there. But actually, we don't have any effective rent control laws anywhere in this country. If you want to look for real rent control laws that work, you have to look outside of the United States. But it's still a situation that the powers that be knows, it's untenable. You can't have that many evictions all at the same time. So, I mean, so what they've done is they've passed this law that is hopefully potentially going to be a temporary fix for at least during the pandemic and these times. And what it will mean is is for all the people that are many thousands of dollars behind on rent, the state money will cover 80% of rent owed as long as the landlords will forgive the other 20%. And the landlord lobby, they are so bent out of shape over the idea of forgiving 20% of the rent. And and we have to putting this in a little bit of context, after the financial crisis of 2008, since that time, the rents in many parts of the country, very much including in Portland, have doubled and tripled and quadrupled. My rent personally has gone up by 240% since I moved here in 2007, and that's typical in this city.
The landlords really, I mean, there's a bit of stupidity here because, I mean, they've got nothing for rent, let's say. So let's assume $1,000 a month, they're out, what, $8,000, $10,000. Okay. So they can get nothing because if they evict the tenant has no money. They're unemployed. What the hell are they? They're not going to pay you $10,000. So take the $8,000 and be happy. I mean, it makes a lot of sense. Portland is one of the fast rising rental markets in the country. And
Portland is the most rent-burdened city in the United States in terms of the
number of
differential. Well, the amount that people make as compared to the amount that they're charged for rent.
Right.
Is the So by that account, it's the most rent-burdened city in the country, even though it's cheaper to live here than it is in Seattle or New York or San Francisco.
January 2011, I understand the average rent for a 1-bedroom apartment was $765 in Portland. And that's now $1,441. So it's almost doubled in 9 years. I don't think anybody's income has doubled in the last 9 years. Not very few people. Jeff Bezos, a few people like that, Bill Gates. Tell me about the law a little bit and what the percentage, what are landlords, let's say, how much are they restricted by the Oregon rent control law at this point?
Well, I mean, I would say, depending on how you define these things, Oregon doesn't really have any rent control laws, but it does have a law that it does have the eviction ban. Which is, I mean, and there's also another law that's being challenged in the courts by the landlord lobby. I don't know what the latest is on that, but the idea that they cannot they cannot raise the rent by more than 10% per year. But that's not an Oregon law. That's a Portland law, and it's being challenged in the courts. And of course, the people that were advocating for rent control laws at the time that they passed this 10% thing were themselves saying this is just ridiculous because 10% is that's crazy. If they raise the rent by 10% every year, then of course it's doubled within a few years. That's not anything anybody can consider a real rent control law, but that's what we got. And it seems like the landlords, many of them, certainly my landlord, the Randall Group, they saw that 10% thing, and I think it inspired them to raise the rent more than they would have otherwise, because maybe they're afraid, that it's going to be another law coming in, which is kind of the problem with these really wimpy laws, is they can have the opposite effect intended. And what we need is a real, actual, effective law that it's not just full of loopholes.
Well, of course, we know why the loopholes are there. I think this is true all over the country, that real estate developers are among the biggest contributors to campaigns,
Yep.
political campaigns, local and state area. They are making an investment there and they're getting the return they wanted, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. It's incredibly profitable investment, the U.S. real estate market, and it is being invested in by capitalists from around the world. And it's part of the reason why it's as distorted as it is, and so not reflective of what people can actually afford to pay. It's just a great investment to buy apartments in New York and Miami that nobody lives in, that you're just keeping off the market. That's just it's just an investment. It's like buying stocks. So you have. I've seen neighborhoods in London that are it's especially notable. Like, I mean, there are cities, I believe, London, Miami, New York. These cities, there's a huge amount of the real estate that's sold in cash. And people buy real estate in cash because they're criminals. That's why people buy real estate with cash. I don't know of any other explanation, but it's perfectly legal in the United States and in England as well, which also has a terrible problem with rent. London is an insanely expensive city as well. It's very much like New York in that sense.
And if people are using apartments, co-ops, or even entire buildings, basically as a method of money laundering, they're bidding those prices up.
Yep.
And the average person whose wages have remained stagnant for the last 30 years, they can't really keep up. Well, let's talk a little bit about what can be done about that. I mean, tell us a little bit about Portland Emergency Eviction Response, what your mission is, your goals are, and what you've been doing.
I think what we're planning on doing is making eviction impossible to carry out, and ultimately the abolition of eviction as a means of landlords to deal with their economic problems. Eviction should not be an option. And there's all kinds of other ways to get money from a renter other than evicting them. Like, say, if a renter is working a job, which most people are, then there's all sorts of ways you can, as a landlord, you can use the law to get your money from the renter. But the easiest, quickest, and least expensive way is to send in armed constables to forcibly evict people, or at least to threaten them with forcible eviction. Most people don't actually get evicted forcibly. They get the eviction notice and they move out voluntarily, so-called, quote, voluntarily. But what we intend to do is anytime authorities want to carry out an eviction and there's a tenant who wants to resist the eviction and risk arrest, then we will show up in as large numbers as possible and try to prevent the eviction from happening. And if the eviction does happen, then our plan is, which is not just a plan, but has actually been done at least once so far in the past few months, we will unevict people. And I'm not taking credit for the Red House by any means, but I've been part of the effort in terms of getting people out there. And the idea is exactly what has happened at the Red House, to unevict people. And the history here, of course, is the 1930s. I mean, in Chicago, evictions were banned because there were so many people that gathered to prevent them or to unevict people who got evicted. And people, many people who aren't familiar with the history may think that this kind of strategy is really impossible or just too much to try to accomplish. And what people say, well, what's going to happen when you leave? Then the police can come back, and yes, they can come back. Which is why, of course, we need to be talking about tenants who are really willing to take some serious risks. Because obviously it's not something most people want to put themselves through unless they have to.
Right.
But basically, if we keep coming back, the police can keep coming back, but we can also keep coming back, and so that's the idea. And we can do that just as easily as the police can, and in larger numbers.
You point out something that I didn't figure on this, which is that not every tenant is going to be up for violating the law technically by staying in their apartment or house while people are outside, resisting an eviction.
Yeah.
And so you end up, this is not a situation where you have selected a family, like in this case, the Kenny family up in the Red House up on Mississippi. You didn't select them as the ideal candidate for your eviction protest. They just happened to be the people who agreed, right?
Absolutely, because anybody who defended the Kinney family, in all likelihood, would have defended any other family that was trying to resist an unjust eviction. Of course, in their case, it's more foreclosure than an eviction. It's a little. They are technically owners of houses, but as far as we're concerned, foreclosures, evictions, it doesn't matter. It's all deeply problematic, as is the division of wealth in this country. And of course, the whole problem goes way, way back too. I mean, it's not, this is not a recent problem. There's the land question in this country has been a big question ever since colonization.
All land basically was stolen, all of it.
Yes.
So, we have to start with that premise. The capitalist idea here is that, I'm going to go out and I'm going to buy some land and I'm going to put my house on it and it's mine. And I can do whatever I want to do, with this land and this house. That's how the country was designed. I mean, that's what everyone did. Whereas that's not the model, apparently, in many other countries. What kind of model might we want to consider, for example?
Well, I mean, what we had really here in the United States, and what we still have to a large extent, but really what we had for up until the Homestead Act, I'd say for the most part, what we had was more of a feudal kind of setup, and most farmers back in the early part of the 19th century, I believe it is accurate to say that most farmers did not own their land; they were tenant farmers. And I may be wrong about the most. I'd have to look that up. Of course, a very significant part of the population were enslaved, and then others were sharecroppers, which is another form of tenant farming. And but in upstate New York, the word sharecropping was not used, but the tenant farming, or just farmers. People were referred to as farmers, but what they were was what we would call them was tenant farmers. They did not own their land, and the standard thing when you were a tenant farmer was that you paid either the landlord every year in perpetuity something like 1/3 of everything that you grew, just because they owned your farmland. Even though you were working the farm, you were doing all the work. The landlord probably did just about nothing other than just owning that land. And in the case of a massive swath of upstate New York, the land was owned by one family, by the Van Rensselaer family, who was given the entire Hudson Valley, both sides of the Hudson River, by the Dutch crown back when New York was a Dutch holding. And then the Rensselaer family just inherited their vast estate when it switched to British rule. The British completely acknowledged and all the Dutch holdings, and they then kept their land. After the American Revolution, as we call that rebellion, this pro-slavery rebellion against British rule, that after that, then they still kept their massive estate, making them the richest family on earth at the time. And then what happened in 1839 was the Rensselaer, the current heir of the Rensselaer estate, raised the rent on all the tenant farmers beyond what they were already paying, which was already barely affordable for most of them. So then they organized a rent strike, and as a result of a 9-year-long rent strike in upstate New York, that is basically one of the things that led directly to the Homestead Act. the Homestead Acts. And the Homestead Acts, as people who are looking at history from a certain lens, which is a very important lens to look through history from, like the anti-racist lens, the Homestead Act was a racist act. It was only white people benefited from it, basically. But at the same time, we have to note that those white people who benefited from the Homestead Act were the working class, were the poor, were the tenants, the former tenant farmers.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And these former tenant farmers, all they had to do was go west and steal somebody else's land, which was already made available to them by the military killing the occupants in the first place, and that sort of thing. And then you settle somebody else's land, and then that was a Homestead Act, and so it was a very negative thing looking at it from a lot of very important perspectives. But from the perspective of the tenant farmers, it was justice.
Yeah, well, it really did, and it also facilitated the move west. Which was, one of the objectives of the government at that point. But yeah,
they could have done it different ways, though. They didn't have to give away all that land. That was not necessary. There's all sorts of other ways they could have. They didn't do that on the East Coast. It was a much more feudal setup on the East Coast. They could have continued the expansion that way with and of course the capitalists, the robber barons. I mean, they made tremendous amounts of money from the Homestead Acts. I mean, the Homestead Acts tremendously benefited the rich, way disproportionately. They were able, just like with the current PPP loans, it's the same kind of thing. It was all these corporations that did not need the money who were taking it and profiting from it, owning entire towns, renting out all the buildings in all the towns. I mean, the railroad barons got so rich from the expansion of the West and all that. The Homestead Acts gave them so much land, but it also did give land to a lot of other people.
Mm-hmm. And, at least part of that was you're saying a response to a rent strike.
Yes.
Against Van Rensselaer rather, in the Hudson Valley. So is the rent strike a technique that we ought to be considering now?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We have, in our household here in Portland, we have not paid rent since March. And so we have we have more money in savings than I've ever had in my life. And because we've got about a year's worth of rent in savings. And, what's been really interesting to me when advocating a rent strike against corporations like the Randall Group, this corporation, they don't even communicate with the renters. I have not once received anything that I would call communication. I mean, the property managers working for the management company, they'll send stuff like, make sure to, turn on your heat in the winter so the pipes don't freeze. And, they'll say stuff like, if you dial 211, you might be able to get some renter assistance, but there's nothing from the corporation about a possibility of forgiving a month's rent or lowering the rent or anything like that. No communication whatsoever. The only communication they do is by giving money to Multifamily Northwest, which is their lobbying arm, and that is the people who are suing the state of Oregon. So we know what they think. They think we are worthless. They think their profits are all that matter. So the rent strike is an important tactic because while many people cannot afford to pay, the vast majority can afford to pay. So the question is whether a rent strike is going to be successful or not is determined not by who can't pay, but who can pay and doesn't. And so the important thing is to be in solidarity with all the people who can't pay and not to pay. And equally important to doing that, to joining the rent strike, is to know that all the people out there who don't join the rent strike, I mean, they may have a good reason to do it. Maybe their landlord is their mom or whatever, and that's fine. Okay, I'm not saying you should strike against your mom, but if you got a corporate landlord, like many of us do, like I'm not sure, it's a large minority, if not a majority of renters. Then you need to join the rent strike, and if you don't join the rent strike, you're undermining the rent strike by paying the rent, and you're also undermining the dreams of all the people who are hoping that they could someday live in a society where they could actually afford to live in. And I need to point out also, for all these people who are paying rent, to a corporate landlord. If you have been to a Black Lives Matter protest and you're paying rent to a corporate landlord, well, I don't think you're really communicating, because if you're paying your rent, then that's a way of saying, actually, Black lives don't matter, because the average Black family in this country cannot afford to live in this city. A 2-bedroom apartment in Portland is way more than the average Black family in this country can afford. So then, whose lives matter? I mean, if Black lives matter, then they should be able to afford, Black people should be able to afford to live in the city. And, right. and if Black lives matter, then white people need to take action, as well as Black and brown and everybody else, to make this city and this whole country a place where Black people can afford to live in, along with everybody else.
Yep. Amen to that. Well, my program is about a half hour, so I think we're getting toward the end of that. Anything else you would like to mention before we sign off for today?
Just that if people want to join the rent strike, join Portland Emergency Eviction Response, then go to artistsforrentcontrol.org.
Artistsforrentcontrol.org. All right. Yeah. Well, good. All right. Well, then, thanks very much, David Rovics, for joining me today. We're going to now listen to David sing Don't Pay the Rent.
There's a suspension on evictions. Stick to your convictions. Don't pay the rent. If at home we have to stay, then most of us can't pay, so don't pay the rent. Tell your landlord, sir, that mortgage can defer, and don't pay the rent. If they start rattling their sabers, say I need to feed my neighbors, and don't pay the rent. It's time now to demand one big union grand. Don't pay the rent. Neoliberalism is dead. It's time to raise your head and don't pay the rent. Strike for the guarantee, a home for everybody. Don't pay the rent. Running water, housing, healthcare all across this earth we share, yeah. Don't pay the rent. Capitalism has failed. Put the billionaires in jail. Don't pay the rent. We need a new world now. Let me tell you how. And don't pay the rent. With mutual aid, a new world can be made. Don't pay the rent. From the ashes of the old, if we stop doing what we're told, and don't pay the rent. Solidarity with society. Don't pay the rent. Our lives matter a lot. The landlord's profits do not. Don't pay the rent. We can redefine what is theirs and ours and mine if we don't pay the rent. There's a suspension on evictions. Stick to your convictions. Don't pay the rent.
Thanks again to David Rovics for joining me this week. You can find links to his podcasts and to the Portland Emergency Eviction Response in the show notes at widerviewradio.podbean.com. If you have comments about this program, please send me an email at widerviewradio@gmail.com or put a note on our Facebook page, Widerview Radio. As always, the views expressed here are those of my guests and myself and may not reflect the views of the management of this radio station. We provoke you to think outside the box and question the narratives you hear from the mainstream media. I hope we have succeeded. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. Thanks for listening to Wider View.